Chapter 9 of Liza of Lambeth by W. Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Hatton43, blogdelaquinzaine.wordpress.com. Thus began a time of love and joy. As soon as her work was over and she had finished tea, Liza would slip out and at some appointed spot meet Jim. Usually it would be at the church, where the Westminster Bridge Road bends down to get to the river, and they would go off, arm in arm, till they came to some place where they could sit down and rest. Sometimes they would walk along the Albert Embankment to Battersea Park, and here sit on the benches, watching the children play. The female cyclist had almost abandoned Battersea for the parks on the other side of the river, but often enough one went by, and Liza, with the old-fashioned prejudice of her class, would look after the rider and make some remark about her, not seldom more forcible than ladylike. Both Jim and she liked children, and tiny, ragged urchins would gather round to have rides on the man's knees or mock fights with Liza. They thought themselves far away from anyone in Weir Street, but twice, as they were walking along, they were met by people they knew. Once it was two workmen coming home from a job at Vauxhall. Liza did not see them till they were quite near. She immediately dropped Jim's arms, and they both cast their eyes to the ground as the men passed, like ostriches, expecting that if they did not look up, they would not be seen. "Did you see 'em, Jim?" asked Liza in a whisper when they had gone by. "I wonder if they see us." Almost instinctively she turned round, and at the same moment one of the men turned too. Then there was no doubt about it. "That did give me a turn," she said. "So it did me," answered Jim. "I simply went all over." "We was bally fools," said Liza. "We ought to have spoken to 'em. Do you think they'll let out?" They heard nothing of it. When Jim afterwards met one of them in a public house, he did not mention a meeting, and they thought that perhaps they had not been recognized. But the second time was worse. It was on the Albert Embankment again. They were met by a party of 4, all of whom lived in the street. Liza's heart sank within her, for there was no chance of escape. She thought of turning quickly and walking in the opposite direction, but there was not time, for the men had already seen them. She whispered to Jim, "Back us up," and as they met she said to one of the men, "Halloa there, where are you off to?" The men stopped, and one of them asked the question back, "Where are you off to?" "Me? Oh, I've just been to the hospital. One of the gals at our place is queer, and so I says to myself I'll go and see her." She faltered a little as she began, but quickly gathered herself together, lying fluently and without hesitation. "And when I come out," she went on, "who should I see just passing the hospital but this here cove, and he says to me, 'What cheer?' says he. 'I'm going to Vauxhall. Come and walk a bit of the way with us.' 'All right,' says I don't mind if I do." One man winked, and another said, "Go it, Liza." She fired up with the dignity of outraged innocence. "What d'you mean by that?" she said. "Do you think I'm kidding?" "Kidding? No. You've only just come up from the country, ain't you?" "Think I'm kidding? What do you think I want to kid for? Liars never believe anyone, that's fact." "Now then, Liza, don't be saucy." "Saucy? I'll smack you in the eye if you say much to me. Come on," she said to Jim, who had been standing sheepishly by, and they walked away. The men shouted, "Now we shan't be long," and went off laughing. After that they decided to go where there was no chance at all of being seen. They did not meet till they got over Westminster Bridge, and thence they made their way into the park. They would lie down on the grass in one another's arms, and thus spend the long summer evenings. After the heat of the day there would be a gentle breeze in the park, and they would take in long breaths of the air. It seemed far away from London, it was so quiet and cool, and Liza, as she lay by Jim's side, felt her love for him overflowing to the rest of the world, and enveloping mankind itself in a kind of grateful happiness. If it could only have lasted, they would stay and see the stars shine out dimly, one by one, from the blue sky, till it grew late, and the blue darkened into black, and the stars glittered in thousands all above them. But as the nights grew cooler, they found it cold on the grass, and the time they had there seemed too short for the long journey they had to make. So crossing the bridge as before, they strolled along the embankment till they came to a vacant bench, and there they would sit, with Liza nestling close up to her lover, and his great arms around her. The rain of September made no difference to them. They went on as usual to their seat beneath the trees, and Jim would take Liza on his knee, and opening his coat, shelter her with it, while she, with her arms round his neck, pressed very close to him, and occasionally gave a little laugh of pleasure and delight. They hardly spoke at all through these evenings, for what had they to say to one another? Often, without exchanging a word, they would sit for an hour with their faces touching, the one feeling on his cheek the hot breath from the other's mouth, while at the end of the time the only motion was an upraising of Liza's lips, a bending down of Jim's, so that they might meet and kiss. Sometimes Liza fell into a light doze, and Jim would sit very still for fear of waking her, and when she roused herself she would smile while he bent down again and kissed her. They were very happy. The hours passed by so quickly that Big Ben striking 12 came upon them as a surprise, and unwillingly they got up and made their way homewards. Their partings were never ending. Each evening Jim refused to let her go from his arms, and tears stood in his eyes at the thought of the separation. "I'd give something," he would say, "if we could be together always." "Never mind, old chap," Liza would answer, herself half crying. "It can't be helped, so we must jolly well lump it." But notwithstanding all their precautions, people in Weir Street appeared to know. First of all, Liza noticed that the woman did not seem quite so cordial as before, and she often fancied they were talking of her. When she passed by, they appeared to look at her, then say something or other, and perhaps burst out laughing. But when she approached, they would immediately stop speaking, and keep silence in a rather awkward, constrained manner. For a long time she was unwilling to believe that there was any change in them, and Jim, who had observed nothing, persuaded her that it was all fancy. But gradually it became clearer, and Jim had to agree with her that somehow or other people had found out. Once, when Liza had been talking to Polly, Jim's daughter, Mrs. Blakeston had called her. When the girl had come to her mother, Liza saw that she spoke angrily, and they both looked across at her. When Liza caught Mrs. Blakeston's eye, she saw in her face a surly scowl, which almost frightened her. She wanted to brave it out, and stepped forward a little to go and speak with the woman, but Mrs. Blakeston, standing still, looked so angrily at her that she was afraid to. When she told Jim, his face grew dark, and he said, "Blast the woman, I'll give her what for if she says anything to you." "Don't strike her, whatever happens, will you, Jim?" said Liza. "She'd better take care then," he answered, and he told her that lately his wife had been sulking, and not speaking to him. The previous night, on coming home after the day's work, and bidding her good evening, she had turned her back on him without answering. "Can't you answer when you're spoke to?" he had said. "Good evening," she had replied sulkily, with her back still turned. After that, Liza noticed that Polly avoided her. "What's up, Polly?" she said to her one day. "You never speaks now. Have you had your tongue cut out?" "Me? I ain't got nothing to speak about that I knows of," answered Polly, abruptly walking off. Liza grew very red, and quickly looked to see if anyone had noticed the incident. A couple of youths sitting on the pavement had seen it, and she saw them nudge one another and wink. Then the fellows about the street began to chaff her. "You look pale," said one of a group to her one day. "You're overworking yourself, you are," said another. "Married life don't agree with Liza, that's what it is," added a third. "Who d'you think you're getting at? I ain't married, and never like to be," she answered. "Liza has all the pleasures of a husband and none of the trouble." "Blimey if I know what you mean," said Liza. "Nah, of course not. You don't know nothing, do you? Innocent as a babe. Our Father which art in heaven. Haven't been in London long, have you?" They spoke in chorus, and Liza stood in front of them, bewildered, not knowing what to answer. "Don't you make no mistake about it, Liza knows a thing or two." "Oh, me darling, I love you fit to kill, but take care your missus ain't round the corner." This was particularly bold, and they all laughed. Liza felt very uncomfortable, and fiddled about with her apron, wondering how she could get away. "Take care you don't get into trouble, that's all," said one of the men, with burlesque gravity. "You might give us a chance, Liza. You come out with me one evening. You ought to give us all a turn, just to show there's no ill feeling." "Blimey if I know what you're talking about. You're all balmy on the crumpet," said Liza indignantly, and turning her back on them, made for home. Among other things that had happened was Sally's marriage. One Saturday a little procession had started from Weir Street, consisting of Sally, in a state of giggling excitement, her fringe magnificent after a whole week of curling papers, clad in a perfectly new velveteen dress of the colour known as electric blue, and Harry, rather nervous and ill at ease, in the unaccustomed restraint of a collar. These two walked arm in arm, and were followed by Sally's mother and uncle, also arm in arm, and the procession was brought up by Harry's brother and a friend. They started with a flourish of trumpets and an old boot, and walked down the middle of Weir Street, accompanied by the neighbours' good wishes. But as they got into the Westminster Bridge Road and nearer to the church, the happy couple grew silent, and Harry began to perspire freely, so that his collar gave him perfect torture. There was a public house just opposite the church, and it was suggested that they should have a drink before going in. As it was a solemn occasion, they went into the private bar, and there Sally's uncle, who was a man of means, ordered 6 pots of beer. "Feeling a bit nervous, Harry?" asked his friend. "Nah," said Harry, as if he had been used to getting married every day of his life. "Bit warm, that's all." "You've very good health, Sally," said her mother, lifting her mug. "This is the last time I shall ever address you as Miss." "And may she be as good a wife as you was," added Sally's uncle. "Well, I don't think my old man ever had no complaint to make about me. I did my duty by him, although it's me as says it," answered the good lady. "Well, mates," said Harry's brother, "I reckon it's about time to go in. So here's to the health of Mr. Henry Atkins and his future missus. And God bless 'em," said Sally's mother. Then they went into the church, and as they solemnly walked up the aisle, a pale-faced young curate came out of the vestry and down to the bottom of the chancel. The beer had had a calming effect on their troubled minds, and both Harry and Sally began to think it a rather good joke. They smiled on each other, and at those parts of the service which they thought suggestive, violently nudged one another in the ribs. When the ring had to be produced, Harry fumbled about in different pockets, and his brother whispered, "Swap me bob, he's gone and lost it." However, all went all right, and Sally, having carefully pocketed the certificate, they went out and had another drink to celebrate the happy event. In the evening, Liza and several friends came into the couple's room, which they had taken in the same house as Sally had lived in before, and drank the health of the bride and bridegroom till they thought fit to retire. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Liza of Lambeth by W. Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Hatton43, blogdelaquinzaine.wordpress.com. It was November. The fine weather had quite gone now, and with it much of the sweet pleasure of Jim and Liza's love. When they came out at night on the embankment, they found it cold and dreary. Sometimes a light fog covered the river banks, and made the lamps glow out dim and large. A light rain would be falling, which sent a chill into their very souls. Foot passengers came along at rare intervals, holding up umbrellas, and staring straight in front of them as they hurried along in the damp and cold. A cab would pass rapidly by, splashing up the mud on each side. The benches were deserted, except perhaps for some poor homeless wretch who could afford no shelter, and huddled up in a corner, with his head buried in his breast, was sleeping heavily like a dead man. The wet mud made Liza's skirts cling about her feet, and the damp would come in and chill her legs and creep up her body till she shivered, and for warmth pressed herself close against Jim. Sometimes they would go into the third-class waiting rooms at Waterloo or Charing Cross and sit there, but it was not like the park or the embankment on summer nights. They had warmth, but the heat made their wet clothes steam and smell, and the gas flared in their eyes, and they hated the people perpetually coming in and out, opening the doors and letting in a blast of cold air. They hated the noise of the guards and porters shouting out the departure of the trains, the shrill whistling of the steam engine, the hurry and bustle and confusion. About 11 o'clock, when the trains grew less frequent, they got some quietness, but then their minds were troubled, and they felt heavy, sad, and miserable. One evening they had been sitting at Waterloo Station. It was foggy outside, a thick, yellow November fog, entering the lungs, and making the mouth taste nasty and the eyes smart. It was about 11:30, and the station was unusually quiet. A few passengers, in wraps and overcoats, were walking to and fro, waiting for the last train, with 1 or 2 porters, were standing about yawning. Liza and Jim had remained for an hour in perfect silence, filled with a gloomy unhappiness, as of a great weight on their brain. Liza was sitting forward, with her elbows on her knees, resting her face on her hands. "I wish I was straight," she said at last, not looking up. "Well, why won't you come along with me altogether, and you'll be all right then," he answered. "Nah, that's no go. I can't do that." He had often asked her to live with him entirely, but she had always refused. "You can come along with me, and I'll take a room in a lodging house in Holloway, and we can live there as if we was married." "What about your work?" "I can get work over the other side as well as I can here. I'm about sick of the way things is going on." "So am I, but I can't leave mother." "She can come too." "Not when I'm not married. I shouldn't like her to know as I'd done wrong." "Well, I'll marry her. Swap me bob. I wants to badly enough." "You can't. You're married already." "That don't matter. If I'll give the missus so much a week out of my screw, she'll sign a paper to give up all claim to me, and then we can get spliced. One of the men as I works with done that, and it was all right." Liza shook her head. "Nah, you can't do that now. It's bigamy, and the cops takes you, and you gets 12 months hard for it." "But swap me bob, Liza. I can't go on like this. You knows the missus. Well, there ain't no bloomin' doubt about it. She knows as you and me are carrying on, and she makes no bones about letting me see it." "She don't do that." "Well, she don't exactly say it, but she sulks and won't speak, and then when I says anything she rounds on me, and calls me all the names she can think of. I'd give her a good hiding, but somehow I don't like her. She makes the place a hell to me, and I'm not going to stand it no longer." "You'll have to sit it then. You can't chuck it." "Yes, I can, and I would if you'd come along with me. I don't believe you like me at all, Liza, or you'd come." She turned towards him and put her arms round his neck. "You know I do, old cock," she said. "I like you better than anyone else in the world, but I can't go away and leave mother." "Bely me if I see why. She's never been much to you. She makes you slave away to pay the rent, and all the money she earns she boozes." "That's true. She ain't been what you might call a good mother to me, but somehow she's my mother, and I don't like to leave her on her own, now she's so old, and she can't do much with the rheumatics. And besides, Jim, dear, it ain't only mother, but there's your own kids. You can't leave them." He thought for a while, and then said, "You're about right there, Liza. I don't know if I could get on without the kids. If I could only take them and you too, swap me bob, I should be happy." Liza smiled sadly. "So you see, Jim, we're in a bloomin' hole, and there ain't no way out of it that I can see." He took her on his knees, and pressing her to him, kissed her very long and very lovingly. "Well, we must trust to luck," she said again. "Perhaps somethin'll happen soon, and everything'll come right in the end, when we gets 4 balls of worsted for a penny." It was past 12, and separating, they went by different ways along the dreary, wet, deserted roads, till they came to Weir Street. The street seemed quite different to Liza from what it had been 3 months before. Tom, the humble adorer, had quite disappeared from her life. One day, 3 or 4 weeks after the August bank holiday, she saw him dawdling along the pavement, and it suddenly struck her that she had not seen him for a long time. But she had been so full of her happiness that she had been unable to think of anyone but Jim. She wondered at his absence, since before, wherever she had been, there was he certain to be also. She passed him, but to her astonishment he did not speak to her. She thought by some wonder he had not seen her, but she felt his gaze resting upon her. She turned back, and suddenly he dropped his eyes and looked down, walking on as if he had not seen her, but blushing furiously. "Tom," she said, "why don't you speak to me?" He started and blushed more than ever. "I didn't know you was there," he stuttered. "Don't tell me," she said. "What's up?" "Nothing as I knows of," he answered uneasily. "I ain't offended you, have I, Tom?" "Nah, not as I knows of," he replied, looking very unhappy. "You don't ever come my way now," she said. "I didn't know as you wanted to see me." "Garn, you knows I likes you as well as anybody." "You likes so many people, Liza," he said, flushing. "What do you mean?" said Liza indignantly, but very red. She was afraid he knew now, and it was from him especially she would have been so glad to hide it. "Nothing," he answered. One doesn't say things like that without any meaning, unless one's a blind fool." "You're right there, Liza," he answered. "I am a blind fool." He looked at her a little reproachfully, she thought, and then he said good-bye and turned away. At first she was horrified that he should know of her love for Jim, but then she did not care. After all, it was nobody's business, and what did anything matter, as long as she loved Jim and Jim loved her? Then she grew angry that Tom should suspect her. He could know nothing but that some of the men had seen her with Jim near Vauxhall, and it seemed mean that he should condemn her for that. Thenceforward, when she ran against Tom, she cut him. He never tried to speak to her, but as she passed him, pretending to look out in front of her, she could see that he always blushed, and she fancied his eyes were very sorrowful. Then several weeks went by, and as she began to feel more and more lonely in the street, she regretted the quarrel. She cried a little as she thought that she had lost his faithful, gentle love, and she would have much liked to be friends with him again. If he had only made some advance, she would have welcomed him so cordially. But she was too proud to go to him herself and beg him to forgive her. And then, how could he forgive her? She had lost Sally too, for on her marriage, Harry had made her give up the factory. He was a young man with principles worthy of a member of Parliament, and he had said, "A woman's place is her home, and if her old man can't afford to keep her without her working in a factory, well, all I can say is that he'd better go and get single." "Quite right too," agreed his mother-in-law, "and what's more, she'll have a baby to look after soon, and that'll take her all her time, and there's no one as knows that better than me, for I've had 12, to say nothing of 2 stills and 1 miss." Liza quite envied Sally her happiness, for the bride was brimming over with song and laughter. Her happiness overwhelmed her. "I am happy," she said to Liza one day a few weeks after her marriage. "You don't know what a good sort Harry is. He's just a darling, and there's no mistaking it. I don't care what other people say, but what I says is, there's nothing like marriage. Never a cross word passes his lips, and mother has all her meals with us, and he says all the better. Well, I'm that happy I simply don't know if I'm standing on my head or on my heels." But alas, it did not last too long. Sally was not so full of joy when next Liza met her, and one day her eyes looked very much as if she had been crying. "What's the matter?" asked Liza, looking at her. "What have you been blubbering about?" "Me?" said Sally, getting very red. "Oh, I've got a bit of a toothache, and, well, I'm rather a fool like, and it hurt so much that I couldn't help crying." Liza was not satisfied, but could get nothing further out of her. Then one day it came out. It was a Saturday night, the time when women in Weir Street weep. Liza went up into Sally's room for a few minutes, on her way to the Westminster Bridge Road, where she was to meet Jim. Harry had taken the top back room, and Liza, climbing up the second flight of stairs, called out as usual, "What ho, Sally!" The door remained shut, although Liza could see that there was a light in the room. But on getting to the door she stood still, for she heard the sound of sobbing. She listened for a minute, and then knocked. There was a little flurry inside, and someone called out, "Who's there?" "Only me," said Liza, opening the door. As she did so, she saw Sally rapidly wipe her eyes and put her handkerchief away. Her mother was sitting by her side, evidently comforting her. "What's up, Sal?" asked Liza. "Nothing," answered Sally, with a brave little gasp to stop the crying, turning her face downwards so that Liza should not see the tears in her eyes. But they were too strong for her, and quickly taking out her handkerchief, she hid her face in it, and began to sob broken-heartedly. Liza looked at the mother in interrogation. "Oh, it's that man again," said the lady, snorting and tossing her head. "Not Harry?" asked Liza in surprise. "Not Harry? Who is it if it ain't Harry, the villain?" "What's he been doing then?" asked Liza again. "Beaten her. That's what he's been doing. Oh, the villain. He ought to be ashamed of hisself, he ought." "I didn't know he was like that," said Liza. "Didn't you? I thought the whole street knew it by now," said Mrs. Cooper indignantly. "Oh, he's a wrong 'un, he is." "It wasn't his fault," put in Sally, amidst her sobs. "It's only because he's had a little drop too much. He's all right when he's sober." "A little drop too much? I should just think he had, the beast. I'd give it him if I was a man. They're all like that. Husbands is all alike. They're all right when they're sober, sometimes, but when they've got liquor in 'em, they're beasts, and no mistake. I had a husband myself for 25 years, and I know 'em." "Well, mother," sobbed Sally, "it was all my fault. I should have come home earlier." "Nah, it wasn't your fault at all. Just look here, Liza. This is what he done, and call hisself a man. Just 'cause Sally'd gone out to have a chat with Mrs. McLeod next door. When she come in, he started banging her about. And me too. What d'you think of that?" Mrs. Cooper was quite purple with indignation. "Yes," she went on, "that's a man for you. Of course, I wasn't going to stand and see my daughter being knocked about. It wasn't likely, was it? And he rounds on me. He hits me with his fist. Look here." She pulled up her sleeves and showed 2 red and brawny arms. "He's bruised my arms. I thought he'd broken it at first. If I hadn't put my arm up, he'd have got me on the head, and he might have killed me. And I says to him, 'If you touch me again, I'll go to the police station, that I will.' Well, that frightened him a bit, and then didn't I let him have it. 'You call yourself a man,' says I. 'You ain't fit to clean the drains out.' You should have heard the language he used. 'You dirty old woman,' says he. 'You go away. You're always interfering with me.' Well, I don't like to repeat what he said, and that's the truth. And I says to him, 'I wish you'd never married my daughter, and if I'd known you was like this, I'd have died sooner than later.'" "Well, I didn't know he was like that," said Liza. "He was all right at first," said Sally. "Yes, they're always all right at first. But to think it should have come to this now, when they ain't been married 3 months, and the first child not born yet, I think it's disgraceful." Liza stayed a little while longer, helping to comfort Sally, who kept pathetically taking to herself all the blame of the dispute, and then, bidding her good night and better luck, she slid off to meet Jim. When she reached the appointed spot, he was not to be found. She waited for some time, and at last saw him come out of the neighbouring pub. "Good night, Jim," she said as she came up to him. "So you've turned up, have you?" he answered roughly, turning round. "What's the matter, Jim?" she asked in a frightened way, for he had never spoken to her in that manner. "Nice thing to keep me waiting all night for you to come out." She saw that he had been drinking, and answered humbly, "I'm very sorry, Jim, but I went in to see Sally, and a bloke had been knocking her about, and so I sat with her a bit." "Knocking her about, had he? And serve her damn well right too, and there's many more as could do with a good hiding." Liza did not answer. He looked at her, and then suddenly said, "Come in and have a drink." "No, I'm not thirsty. I don't want a drink," she answered. "Come on," he said angrily. "Nah, Jim, you've had quite enough already." "Who are you talking to?" he said. "Don't come if you don't want to. I'll go and have one by myself." "Nah, Jim, don't." She caught hold of his arm. "Yes, I shall," he said, going towards the pub, while she held him back. "Let me go, can't you? Let me go." He roughly pulled his arm away from her. As she tried to catch hold of it again, he pushed her back, and in the little scuffle caught her a blow over the face. "Ow!" she cried. "You did hurt." He was sobered at once. "Liza," he said, "I ain't hurt you." She didn't answer, and he took her in his arms. "Liza, I ain't hurt you, have I? Say I ain't hurt you. I'm so sorry. I beg your pardon, Liza." "All right, old chap," she said, smiling charmingly on him. "It wasn't the blow that hurt me so much. It was the way you was talking." "I didn't mean it, Liza." He was so contrite. He could not humble himself enough. "I had another bloomin' row with the missus tonight. Then, when I didn't find you here, and I kept waiting and waiting, well, I fair downright lost my hair. 2 or 3 pints of 4.5 and, well, I dunno. Never mind, old cock. I can stand more than that as long as you loves me." He kissed her, and they were quite friends again. But the little quarrel had another effect which was worse for Liza. When she woke up the next morning, she noticed a slight soreness over the ridge of the bone under the left eye, but on looking in the glass saw that it was black and blue and green. She bathed it, but it remained, and seemed to get more marked. She was terrified lest people should see it, and kept indoors all day, but next morning it was blacker than ever. She went to the factory with her hat over her eyes and her head bent down. She escaped observation, but on the way home she was not so lucky. The sharp eyes of some of the girls noticed it first. "What's the matter with your eye?" asked one of them. "Me?" answered Liza, putting her hand up as if in ignorance. "Nothing that I knows of." 2 or 3 young men were standing by, and hearing the girl, looked up. "Why, you've got a black eye, Liza." "Me? I ain't got no black eye." "Yes, you have. How'd you get it?" "I dunno," said Liza. "I didn't know I had one." "Go on, tell us another," was the answer. One doesn't get a black eye without knowing how they got it. Well, I did fall against the chest of drawers yesterday. I suppose I must have got it then. Oh yes, we believe that, don't we? I didn't know he was so handy with his dukes. Did you, Ted? Asked one man of another. Liza felt herself grow red to the tips of her toes. Who? She asked. Never you mind, nobody you know. At that moment Jim's wife passed and looked at her with a scowl. Liza wished herself 100 miles away, and blushed more violently than ever. What are you blushing about? Ingenuously asked one of the girls. And they all looked from her to Mrs. Blakeston and back again. Someone said, How about our Sunday boots on now? And a titter went through them. Liza's nerve deserted her. She could think of nothing to say, and a sob burst from her. To hide the tears which were coming from her eyes, she turned away and walked homewards. Immediately, a great shout of laughter broke from the group, and she heard them positively screaming till she got into her own house. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Liza of Lambeth by W. Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Hatton43, blogdelaquinzaine.wordpress.com. A few days afterwards, Liza was talking with Sally, who did not seem very much happier than when Liza had last seen her. He ain't what I thought he was, she said. I don't mind saying that, but he has a lot to put up with. I expect I'm rather trying sometimes, and he means well. Perhaps he'll be kinder like when the baby's born. Cheer up, old gal, answered Liza, who had seen something of the lives of many married couples. It won't seem so bad after you gets used to it. It's a bit disappointing at first, but you gets not to mind it. After a little, Sally said she must go and see about her husband's tea. She said good-bye, and then rather awkwardly, Say, Liza, take care of yourself. Take care of myself? Why? Asked Liza in surprise. You know what I mean. Nah, darned if I do. That there Mrs. Blakeston, she's looking out for you. Mrs. Blakeston? Liza was startled. Yes, she says she's going to give you something if she can get hold on you. I should advise you take care. Me? Said Liza. Sally looked away so as not to see the other's face. She says as how you've been messing about with her old man. Liza didn't say anything, and Sally, repeating her goodbye, slid off. Liza felt a chill run through her. She had several times noticed a scowl and a look of anger on Mrs. Blakeston's face, and she had avoided her as much as possible. But she had no idea that the woman meant to do anything to her. She was very frightened. A cold sweat broke out over her face. If Mrs. Blakeston got hold of her, she would be helpless. She was so small and weak, while the other was strong and muscular. Liza wondered what she would do if she did catch her. That night she told Jim, and tried to make a joke of it. I say, Jim, your missus. She says she's going to give me socks if she catches me. My missus? How'd you know? She's been telling people in the street. Gorlumme, said Jim, furious. If she dares to touch a hair of your head, swap me dicky, I'll give her such a hiding as she's never had before. By God, give me the chance, and I would let her have it. I'm bloomin' well sick of her sulks. He clenched his fists as he spoke. Liza was a coward. She could not help thinking of her enemy's threat. It got on her nerves, and she hardly dared go out for fear of meeting her. She would look nervously in front of her, quickly turning round if she saw in the distance anyone resembling Mrs. Blakeston. She dreamed of her at night. She saw the big, powerful form, the heavy, frowning face, and the curiously braided brown hair, and she would wake up with a cry and find herself bathed in sweat. It was the Saturday afternoon following this, a chilly November day, the road sloshy, and a grey, comfortless sky that made one's spirits sink. It was about 3 o'clock, and Liza was coming home from work. She got into Weir Street, and was walking quickly towards her house when she saw Mrs. Blakeston coming towards her. Her heart gave a great jump. Turning, she walked rapidly in the direction she had come. With a screw round of her eyes, she saw that she was being followed, and therefore went straight out of Weir Street. She went right round, meaning to get into the street from the other end, and, unobserved, slip into her house, which was then quite close. But she dared not risk it immediately, for fear Mrs. Blakeston should still be there, so she waited about for half an hour. It seemed an age. Finally, Taking her courage in both hands, she turned the corner and entered Weir Street. She nearly ran into the arms of Mrs. Blakeston, who was standing close to the public-house door. Liza gave a little cry, and the woman said, with a sneer, "You didn't expect to see me, did you?" Liza did not answer, but tried to walk past her. Mrs. Blakeston stepped forward and blocked her way. "You seem to be in a mighty fine hurry," she said. "Yes, I've got to get home," said Liza, again trying to pass. "But supposing I don't let you," remarked Mrs. Blakeston, preventing her from moving. "Why don't you leave me alone?" Liza said. "I ain't interfering with you." "Not interfering with me, aren't you? I like that." "Let me go by," said Liza. "I don't want to talk to you." "No, I know that," said the other, "but I want to talk to you, and I shan't let you go until I've said what I wants to say." Liza looked round for help. At the beginning of the altercation, the loafers about the public-house had looked up with interest, and gradually gathered round in a circle. Passers-by had joined in, and a number of other people in the street, seeing the crowd, added themselves to it to see what was going on. Liza saw that all eyes were fixed on her, the men amused and excited, the woman unsympathetic, rather virtuously indignant. Liza wanted to ask for help, but there were so many people, and they all seemed so much against her, that she had not the courage to. So, having surveyed the crowd, she turned her eyes to Mrs. Blakeston, and stood in front of her, trembling a little, and very white. "Nah, he ain't here," said Mrs. Blakeston sneeringly, "so you needn't look for him." "I don't know what you mean," answered Liza, "and I want to go away. I ain't done nothing to you." "Not done nothing to me?" furiously repeated the woman. "I'll tell you what you've done to me. You've robbed me of my husband, you have. I've never had a word with my husband until you took him from me, and now it's all you with him. He's got no time for his wife and family. It's all you. And his money too. I never get a penny of it. If it weren't for the little bit I'd saved up in the saving bank, me and my children would be starving now, and all through you." She shook her fist at her. "I never had any money from anyone." "Don't talk to me. I know you did, you dirty bitch. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, taking a married man from his family, and him old enough to be your father." "She's right there," said one or two of the onlooking women. "There can't be no good in her if she takes somebody else's husband." "I'll give it you," proceeded Mrs. Blakeston, getting more hot and excited, brandishing her fist, and speaking in a loud voice, hoarse with rage. "Oh, I've been trying to get hold on you this 4 weeks. Why, you're a prostitute, that's what you are." "I'm not," answered Liza indignantly. "Yes, you are," repeated Mrs. Blakeston, advancing menacingly so Liza shrank back. "And what's more, he treats you like one. I know he'd give you that black eye. That shows what he thinks of you. And serve you blooming well right if he'd give you one in both eyes." Mrs. Blakeston stood close in front of her, her heavy jaw protruded, and the frown of her eyebrows dark and stern. For a moment she stood silent, contemplating Liza, while the surrounders looked on in breathless interest. "You dirty little bitch, you," she said at last. "Take that." With her open hand she gave her a sharp smack on the cheek. Liza started back with a cry, and put her hand up to her face. "And take that," added Mrs. Blakeston, repeating the blow. Gathering up the spittle in her mouth, she spat in Liza's face. Liza sprang on her, and with her hands spread out like claws, buried her nails in the woman's face, and drew them down her cheeks. Mrs. Blakeston caught hold of her hair with both hands, and tugged at it as hard as she could. But they were immediately separated. "Here, hold hard," said some of the men. "Fight her out fair and square. Don't go scratching and mauling like that." "I'll fight her, I don't mind," shouted Mrs. Blakeston, tucking up her sleeves and savagely glaring at her opponent. Liza stood in front of her, pale and trembling, as she looked at her enemy and saw the long red marks of her nails with blood coming from one or two of them. She shrank back. "I don't want to fight," she said hoarsely. "No, I don't suppose you do," hissed the other, "but you're damn well after." "She's ever so much bigger than me, I've got no chance," added Liza tearfully. "You should have thought of that before. Come on." And with these words Mrs. Blakeston rushed upon her. She hit her with both fists, one after the other. Liza did not try to guard herself, but imitating the woman's motion, hit out with her own fists, and for a minute or two they continued thus, raining blows on one another with the same windmill motion of the arms. But Liza could not stand against the other woman's weight. The blows came down heavy and rapid all over her face and head. She put up her hands to cover her face, and turned her head away, while Mrs. Blakeston kept on hitting mercilessly. "Time!" shouted some of the men. "Time!" And Mrs. Blakeston stopped to rest herself. "It don't seem hardly fair to set them two on together. Liza's got no chance against a big woman like that," said a man among the crowd. Well, it's her own fault, answered a woman. She didn't ought to mess about with her husband. Well, I don't think it's right, added another man. She's getting it too much. And serve her right too, said one of the women. She deserves all she gets, and a damn sight more into the bargain. Quite right, put in a third. A woman's got no right to take someone's husband from her, and if she does, she's bloomin' lucky if she gets off with a hiding. That's what I think. So do I, but I wouldn't have thought it of Liza. I never thought she was a wrong 'un. Pretty specimen she is, said a little dark woman who looked like a Jewess. If she messed about with my old man, I'd stick her. I swear I would. Now she's been carrying on with one, she'll try and get others. You see if she don't. She'd better not come round my house. I'll soon give her what for. Meanwhile, Liza was standing at one corner of the ring, trembling all over and crying bitterly. One of her eyes was bunged up, and her hair, all dishevelled, was hanging down over her face. Two young fellows, who had constituted themselves her seconds, were standing in front of her, offering rather ironical comfort. One of them had taken the bottom corners of her apron and was fanning her with it, while the other was showing her how to stand and hold her arms. You stand up to her, Liza, he was saying. There ain't no good funk in it. You'll simply get it all the worse. You give it her back. Give her one on the boko like this, see? You must show a bit of pluck, you know. Liza tried to check her sobs. Yes, hit her hard, that's what you've got to do, said the other. And if you find she's getting the better on you, you close on her and catch hold of her hair and scratch her. You've marked her with your nails, Liza. By gosh, you did fly on her when she span at you. That's the way to do the job. Then turning to his fellow, he said, Do you remember that fight as old Mother Craig had with another woman in the street last year? Nah, he answered. I never saw that. It was a corker, and the cops come in and took 'em both off to quad. Liza wished the policeman would come and take her off. She would willingly have gone to prison to escape the fiend in front of her, but no help came. Time's up, shouted the referee. Fire away. Take care of the cops, shouted a man. There's no fear about them, answered somebody else. They always keeps out of the way when there's anything going on. Fire away. Mrs. Blakeston attacked Liza madly, but the girl stood up bravely, and as well as she could gave back the blows she received. The spectators grew tremendously excited. Got him again, they shouted. Give it her, Liza, that's a good 'un. Hit her hard. 2-1 on the old 'un, shouted a sporting gentleman, but Liza found no backers. Ain't she standing up well now she's roused, cried someone. Oh, she's got pluck in her, she has. That's a knockout, they shouted, as Mrs. Blakeston brought her fist down onto Liza's nose. The girl staggered back, and blood began to flow. Then, losing all fear, mad with rage, she made a rush on her enemy, and rained down blows all over her nose and eyes and mouth. The woman recoiled at the sudden violence of the onslaught, and the men cried, By God, the little un's getting the best of it. But quickly recovering herself, the woman closed with Liza, and dug her nails into her flesh. Liza caught hold of her hair and pulled with all her might, turning her teeth on Mrs. Blakeston, tried to bite her. And thus for a minute they swayed about, scratching, tearing, biting, sweat and blood pouring down their faces, and their eyes fixed on one another, bloodshot and full of rage. The audience shouted and cheered and clapped their hands. What the hell's up here? I say, look there, said some of the women, in a whisper. It's the husband. He stood on tiptoe and looked over the crowd. My God, he said, it's Liza. Then roughly pushing the people aside, he made his way through the crowd into the centre, and thrusting himself between the two women, tore them apart. He turned furiously on his wife. By God, I'll give you something for this. For a moment they all three stood silently looking at one another. Another man had been attracted by the crowd, and he too pushed his way through. Come home, Liza, he said. Tom. He took hold of her arm and led her through the people, who gave way to let her pass. They walked silently through the street, Tom very grave, Liza weeping bitterly. Oh, Tom, she sobbed after a while, I couldn't help it. Then, when her tears permitted, I do love him so. When they got to the door, she plaintively said, Come in, and he followed her to her room. Here she sank onto a chair and gave herself up to her tears. Tom wetted the end of a towel and began wiping her face, grimy with blood and tears. She let him do it, just moaning amid her sobs. You are good to me, Tom. Cheer up, old gal, he said kindly. It's all over now. After a while, the excess of crying brought its cessation. She drank some water, and then taking up a broken hand-glass, she looked at herself, saying, I am a sight. and proceeded to wind up her hair. "You have been good to me, Tom," she repeated, her voice still broken with sobs, and as he sat down beside her, she took his hand. "No, I ain't," he said. "It's only what anybody would have done." "You know, Tom," she said after a little silence, "I'm so sorry I spoke cross like when I met you in the street. You ain't spoke to me since. Oh, that's all over now, lady. We needn't think of that." "Oh, but I have treated you bad. I'm a regular wrong 'un, I am." He pressed her hand without speaking. "I say, Tom," she began, after another pause, "did you know that, well, you know, before today?" He blushed as he answered, "Yes." She spoke very sadly and slowly. "I thought you did. You seemed so cut up when I used to meet you. You did love me then, Tom, didn't you?" "I do now, dearie," he answered. "Ah, it's too late now," she sighed. "Do you know, Liza," he said, "I'm just about kicked the life out of a fella 'cause he said you was messing about with him." "And you knew I was?" "Yes, but I wasn't going to have anyone say it before me. They've all rounded on me except you, Tom. I'd have done better if I'd taken you when you asked me. I shouldn't be where I am now if I had." "Well, won't you now? Won't you have me now?" "Me? After what's happened?" "Oh, I don't mind about that. That don't matter to me if you'll marry me." "I fair can't live without you, Liza. Won't you?" She groaned. "No, I can't, Tom. It wouldn't be right." "Why not, if I don't mind?" "Tom," she said, looking down, almost whispering, "I'm like that, you know." "What do you mean?" She could scarcely utter the words. "I think I'm in the family way." He paused a moment, then spoke again. "Well, I don't mind, if you'll only marry me." "No, I can't, Tom," she said, bursting into tears. "I can't, but you are so good to me. I'd do anything to make it up to you." She put her arms round his neck and slid onto his knees. "You know, Tom, I couldn't marry you now. But anything else, if you wants me to do anything else, I'll do it if it'll make you happy." He did not understand, but only said, "You're a good gal, Liza," and bending down he kissed her gravely on the forehead. Then with a sigh he lifted her down, and getting up, left her alone. For a while she sat where he left her, but as she thought of all she had gone through, her loneliness and misery overcame her. The tears welled forth, and throwing herself on the bed, she buried her face in the pillow. Jim stood looking at Liza as she went off with Tom, and his wife watched him jealously. "It's her you're thinking about. Of course you'd have liked to take her home yourself. I know, and leave me to shift for myself." "Shut up," said Jim, angrily turning on her. "I shan't shut up," she answered, raising her voice. "Nice husband you are. Golummy, as good as they make 'em. Nice thing to go and leave your wife and children for a thing like that, at your age too. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Why, it's like messing about with your own daughter. By God," he ground his teeth with rage, "if you don't leave me alone, I'll kick the life out of you." "There," she said, turning to the crowd. "There, see how he treats me. Listen to that. I've been his wife for 20 years, and you couldn't have had a better wife, and I've bore him 9 children, yet say nothing of a miscarriage, and I've got another coming, and that's how he treats me. Nice husband, ain't it?" She looked at him scornfully, then again at the surrounders, as if for their opinion. "Well, I ain't going to stay here all night. Get out of the light." He pushed aside the people who barred his way, and the 1 or 2 who growled a little at his roughness, looking at his angry face, were afraid to complain. "Look at him," said his wife. "He's afraid, he is. See him slinking away like a bloomin' mongrel with his tail between his legs. Ugh!" She walked just behind him, shouting and brandishing her arms. "You dirty beast, you," she yelled, "to go fooling about with a little girl. Ugh! I wish you wasn't my husband. I wouldn't be seen drowned with you if I could help it. You make me sick to look at you." The crowd followed them on both sides of the road, keeping at a discreet distance, but still eagerly listening. Jim turned on her once or twice and said, "Shut up." But it only made her more angry. "I tell you, I shan't shut up. I don't care who knows it. You are. I'm ashamed the children should have such a father as you. Do you think I didn't know what you was up to them nights you was away, courting? Yes, courting. You're a nice man, you are." Jim did not answer her, but walked on. At last he turned round to the people who were following, and said, "Now then, what do you want here? You jolly well clear, or I'll give some of you something." They were mostly boys and women, and at his words they shrank back. "He's afraid to say anything to me," jeered Mrs. Blakeston. "He's a beauty." Jim entered his house, and she followed him till they came up into their room. Polly was giving the children their tea. They all started up as they saw their mother with her hair and clothes in disorder, blotches of dried blood on her face, and the long scratch marks. "Oh, mother," said Polly, "what is the matter?" "He's the matter," she answered, pointing to her husband. "It's through him I've got all this. Look at your father, children. He's a father to be proud of, leaving you to starve and spending his week's money on a dirty little strumper." Jim felt easier now. He had not got so many strange eyes on him. "Now look here," he said, "I'm not going to stand this much longer, so just you take care. I ain't afraid of you. I know you'd like to kill me, but you'll get strung up if you do. No, I won't kill you, but if I have any more of your sauce, I'll do the next thing to it. Touch me if you dare," she said. "I'll have the law on you, and I shouldn't mind how many months hard you got." "Be quiet," he said, and closing his hand, gave her a heavy blow in the chest that made her stagger. "Oh, you!" she screamed. She seized the poker, and in a fury of rage rushed at him. "Would you?" he said, catching hold of it and wrenching it from her grasp. He threw it to the end of the room and grappled with her. For a moment they swayed about from side to side. Then with an effort he lifted her off her feet and threw her to the ground. But she caught hold of him, and he came down on top of her. She screamed as her head thumped the floor, and the children, who were standing huddled up in a corner, terrified, screamed too. Jim caught hold of his wife's head and began beating it against the floor. She cried out, "You're killing me! Help! Help!" Polly in terror ran up to her father and tried to pull him off. "Father, don't hit her! Anything but that, for God's sake!" "Leave me alone," he said, "or I'll give you something too." She caught hold of his arm, but Jim, still kneeling on his wife, gave Polly a backhanded blow which sent her staggering back. "Take that!" Polly ran out of the room, downstairs to the first floor front, where 2 men and 2 women were sitting at tea. "Oh, come and stop father," she cried. "He's killing mother." "Why, what's he doing?" "Oh, he's got her on the floor, and he's banging her head. He's paying her out for giving Liza Kemp a hiding." One of the women started up and said to her husband, "Come on, John, you go and stop it." "Don't you, John," said the other man. "When a man's giving his wife socks, it's best not to interfere." "But he's killing her," repeated Polly, trembling with fright. "Gone," rejoined the man. "She'll get over it, and perhaps she deserves it too, for all you know." John sat undecided, looking now at Polly, now at his wife, and now at the other man. "Oh, do be quick, for God's sake," said Polly. At that moment a sound as of something smashing was heard upstairs, and a woman's shriek. Mrs. Blakeston, in an effort to tear herself away from her husband, had knocked up against the washhand stand, and the whole thing had crashed down. "Go on, John," said the wife. "No, I ain't going. I shan't do no good, and it'll only round on me." "Well, you are a bloomin' lot of cowards, that's all I can say," indignantly answered the wife. "But I ain't going to see a woman murdered. I'll go and stop him." With that she ran upstairs and threw open the door. Jim was still kneeling on his wife, hitting her furiously, while she was trying to protect her head and face with her hands. "Leave off!" shouted the woman. Jim looked up. "Who the devil are you?" he said. "Leave off, I tell you. Aren't you ashamed of yourself, knocking a woman about like that?" And she sprang at him, seizing his fist. "Let go," he said, "or I'll give you a bit." "You'd better not touch me," she said, "you dirty coward. Why, look at her, she's almost senseless." Jim stopped and gazed at his wife. He got up and gave her a kick. "Get up," he said, but she remained huddled on the floor, moaning feebly. The woman from downstairs went on her knees and took her head in her arms. "Never mind, Mrs. Blakeston. He's not going to touch her. Here, drink this little drop of water." Then, turning to Jim with infinite disdain, "You dirty blackguard, you. If I was a man, I'd give you something for this." Jim put on his hat and went out, slamming the door, while the woman shouted after him, "Good riddance." "Lord love you," said Mrs. Kemp, "what is the matter?" She had just come in, and opening the door, had started back in surprise at seeing Liza on the bed, all tears. Liza made no answer, but cried as if her heart were breaking. Mrs. Kemp went up to her and tried to look at her face. "Don't cry, dearie. Tell us what it is." Liza sat up and dried her eyes. "I am so unhappy." "What have you been doing to your face? My!" "Nothing." "Go on, you can't have a face like that all by itself." "I had a bit of a scrimmage with a woman down the street," sobbed out Liza. "She's as give you a doing, and you're all upset, and look at your eye. I brought in a little bit of steak for tomorrow's dinner. You just cut a bit off, and put it over your optic. That'll soon put it right. I always used to do that myself when me and your poor father had words. Oh, I'm all over in a tremble, and my head does feel bad. I know what you want, remarked Mrs. Kemp, nodding her head, and it so happens I've got the very thing with me. She pulled a medicine bottle out of her pocket, and taking out the cork, smelt it. That's good stuff. None of your fire-water or your methylated spirit. I don't often indulge in such things, but when I do, I likes to have the best. She handed the bottle to Liza, who took a mouthful and gave it her back. She had a drink herself, and smacked her lips. That's good stuff. Have a drop more. Nah, said Liza. I ain't used to drinking spirits. She felt dumb and miserable, and a heavy pain throbbed through her head. If she could only forget. Nah, I know you're not, but bless your soul, that won't hurt you. It'll do you no end of good. Why, often when I've been feeling that done up that I didn't know what to do with myself, I've just had a little drop of whiskey or gin. I'm not particular what spirit it is, and it's pulled me up wonderful. Liza took another sip, a slightly longer one. It burned as it went down her throat, and sent through her a feeling of comfortable warmth. I really do think it's doing me good, she said, wiping her eyes and giving a sigh of relief as the crying ceased. I knew it would. Take my word for it. If people took a little drop of spirits in time, there'd be much less sickness about. They sat for a while in silence. Then Mrs. Kemp remarked, You know, Liza, it strikes me as how we could do with a drop more. You not being in the habit of taking anything, I only just brought this little drop for me, and it ain't took us long to finish that up. But as you're an invalid, like we'll get a little more this time. It's sure to turn out useful. But you ain't got nothing to put it in. Yes, I have, answered Mrs. Kemp. There's that bottle as they gives me at the hospital. Just empty the medicine out into the pile, and wash it out, and I'll take it round to the pub myself. Liza, when she was left alone, began to turn things over in her mind. She did not feel so utterly unhappy as before, but the things she had gone through seemed further away. After all, she said, it doesn't so much matter. Mrs. Kemp came in. Have a little drop more, Liza, she said. Well, I don't mind if I do. I'll get some tumblers, shall I? There's no mistake about it, she added, when she had taken a little. It do buck you up. You're right, Liza, you're right, and you wanted it badly. Fancy you having a fight with a woman. Oh, I've had some in my day, but then I wasn't a little bit of a thing like you is. I wish I'd been there. I wouldn't have stood by and looked on while my daughter was getting the worst of it. Although I'm turned 65 and getting on for 66, I'd have said to her, if you touch my daughter, you'll have me to deal with, so just look out. She brandished her glass, and that reminding her, she refilled it and Liza's. Ah, Liza, she remarked, you're a chip off the old block. To see you setting there and having your little drop, it makes me feel as if I was living a better life. You used to be rather hard on me, Liza, because I took a little drop on Saturday nights. And mind, I don't say I didn't take a little drop too much sometimes. Accidents will occur even in the best regulated of families. But what I say is this, it's good stuff. I say, and it don't hurt you. Buck up, old gal, said Liza, filling the glasses. No heel taps. I feel like a new woman now. I was that down in the dumps. Well, I shouldn't have cared if I'd been at the bottom of the river, and that's the truth. You don't say so, replied her affectionate mother. Yes, I do, and I mean it too, but I don't feel like that now. You're right, mother. When you're in trouble, there's nothing like a bit of spirit. Well, if I don't know who does. For the trouble I've had, it'd be enough to kill many women. Well, I've had 13 children, and you can think what that was. Every one I had, I used to say I wouldn't have no more, but one does, you know. You'll have a family some day, Liza, and I shouldn't wonder if you didn't have as many as me. We come from a very prodigal family, we do. We've all gone into double figures, except your Aunt Mary, who only had 3, but then she wasn't married, so it didn't count like. They drank each other's health. Everything was getting blurred to Liza. She was losing her head. Yes, went on Mrs. Kemp, I've had 13 children, and I'm proud of it. As your poor dear father used to say, it shows as how one gets the blood of a Briton in one. Your poor dear father, he was a great hand at speaking, he was. He used to speak at parliamentary meetings. I really believe he'd have been a member of Parliament if he'd been alive now. Well, as I was saying, your father used to say, none of your small families for me. I don't approve of them, says he. He was a man of very high principles, and by politics he was a radical. No, says he, when he got talking, when a man can have a family rising into double figures, It shows he's got the backbone of a Briton in him. That's the stuff has built up England's name and glory. When one thinks of the mighty British Empire, says he, on which the sun never sets from morning till night, one has to be proud of himself, and one has to do one's duty in that walk of life in which it pleased Providence to set one, and every man's first duty is to get as many children as he bloomin' well can. Lord love you, he could talk, I can tell you. "Drink up, mother," said Liza. "You're not half drinking." She flourished the bottle. "I don't care a twopenny hang for all them blokes. I'm quite happy, and I don't want anything else." "I can see you're my daughter now," said Mrs. Kemp. "When you used to round on me, I used to think as how if I hadn't carried you for 9 months, it must have been some mistake, and you wasn't my daughter at all. When you come to think of it, a man, he don't know if it's his child or somebody else's. But you can't deceive a woman like that. You couldn't palm off somebody else's kid on her." "I am beginning to feel quite lively," said Liza. "I don't know what it is, but I feel as if I wanted to laugh till I fairly split my sides." And she began to sing, "For he's a jolly good feller, for he's a jolly good feller." Her dress was all disarranged, her face covered with the scars of scratches, and clots of blood had fixed under her nose. Her eye had swollen up so that it was nearly closed and red. Her hair was hanging over her face and shoulders, and she laughed stupidly and leered with heavy, sodden ugliness. "Dizzy, Dizzy, I can't afford a carriage, but you'll look neat on the seat of a bicycle made for two." She shouted out the tunes, beating time on the table, and her mother, grinning with her thin, grey hair hanging dishevelled over her head, joined in with her weak, cracked voice. "Oh, dem golden kippers, oh!" Then Liza grew more melancholy and broke into Auld Lang Syne. Should the old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? For Auld Lang Syne. Finally they both grew silent, and in a little while there came a snore from Mrs. Kemp. Her head fell forward to her chest. Liza tumbled from her chair onto the bed, and sprawling across it, fell asleep. "Although I am drunk and bad, be you kind. Cast a glance at this heart which is bewildered and distressed. O God, take away from my mind my cry and my complaint. Offer wine, and take sorrow from my remembrance. Offer wine." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Liza of Lambeth by W. Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Hatton43, blogdelaquinzaine.wordpress.com. About the middle of the night Liza woke. Her mouth was hot and dry, and a sharp cutting pain passed through her head as she moved. Her mother had evidently roused herself, for she was lying in bed by her side, partially undressed, with all the bedclothes rolled round her. Liza shivered in the cold night, and taking off some of her things, her boots, her skirt and jacket, got right into bed. She tried to get some of the blanket from her mother, but as she pulled, Mrs. Kemp gave a growl in her sleep and drew the clothes more tightly round her. So Liza put over herself her skirt and a shawl, which was lying over the end of the bed, and tried to go to sleep. But she could not. Her head and hands were broiling hot, and she was terribly thirsty. When she lifted herself up to get a drink of water, such a pang went through her head that she fell back on the bed groaning, and lay there with a beating heart. And strange pains that she did not know went through her. Then a cold shiver seemed to rise in the very marrow of her bones, and run down every artery and vein, freezing the blood. Her skin puckered up, and drawing up her legs she lay huddled together in a heap, the shawl wrapped tightly round her, and her teeth chattering. Shivering, she whispered, "Oh, I'm so cold, so cold. Mother, give me some clothes. I shall die of the cold. Oh, I'm freezing." But after a while the cold seemed to give way, and a sudden heat seized her, flushing her face, making her break out into perspiration, so that she threw everything off, and loosened the things about her neck. "Give us a drink," she said. "Oh, I'd give anything for a little drop of water." There was no one to hear. Mrs. Kemp continued to sleep heavily, occasionally breaking out into a little snore. Liza remained there, now shivering with cold, now panting for breath, listening to the regular, heavy breathing by her side, and in her pain she sobbed. She pulled at her pillow and said, "Why can't I go to sleep? Why can't I sleep like her?" And the darkness was awful. It was a heavy, ghastly blackness that seemed palpable, so that it frightened her, and she looked for relief at the faint light glimmering through the window from a distant street lamp. She thought the night would never end. The minutes seemed like hours, and she wondered how she should live through till morning, and strange pains that she did not know went through her. Still the night went on. The darkness continued, cold and horrible, and her mother breathed loudly and steadily by her side. At last, with the morning, sleep came, but the sleep was almost worse than the wakefulness, for it was accompanied by ugly, disturbing dreams. Liza thought she was going through the fight with her enemy, and Mrs. Blakeston grew enormous in size and multiplied, so that every way she turned the figure confronted her, and she began running away, and she ran and ran till she found herself reckoning up an account she had puzzled over in the morning, and she did it backwards and forwards, upwards and downwards, starting here, starting there, and the figures got mixed up with other things, and she had to begin over again, and everything jumbled up, and her head whirled, till finally, with a start, she woke. The darkness had given way to a cold grey dawn, her uncovered legs were chilled to the bone, and by her side she heard again the regular, nasal breathing of the drunkard. For a long while she lay where she was, feeling very sick and ill, but better than in the night. At last her mother woke. "Liza," she called. "Yes, mother," she answered feebly. "Get us a cup of tea, will you?" "I can't, mother, I'm ill." "Garn," said Mrs. Kemp in surprise. Then looking at her, "Swap me bob, what's up with you? Why, your cheeks is flushed, and your forehead it is hot. What's the matter with you, girl?" "I dunno," said Liza. "I've been that bad all night, I thought I was going to die." "I know what it is," said Mrs. Kemp, shaking her head. "The fact is, you ain't used to drinking, and of course it's upset you. Now me, why I'm as fresh as a daisy. Take my word, there ain't no good in teetotalism. It finds you out in the end, and it's found you out." Mrs. Kemp considered it a judgment of Providence. She got up and mixed some whiskey and water. "Here, drink this," she said. "When one's had a drop too much at night, there's nothing like having a drop more in the morning to put one right. It just acts like magic." "Take it away," said Liza, turning from it in disgust. "The smell of it gives me the sick. I'll never touch spirits again." "Ah, that's what we all says sometime in our lives, but we does, and what's more, we can't do without it. Why me, the hard life I've had—" It is unnecessary to repeat Mrs. Kemp's repetitions. Liza did not get up all day. Tom came to inquire after her, and was told she was very ill. Liza plaintively asked whether anyone else had been, and sighed a little when her mother answered no. But she felt too ill to think much or trouble much about anything. The fever came again as the day wore on, and the pains in her head grew worse. Her mother came to bed, and quickly went off to sleep, leaving Liza to bear her agony alone. She began to have frightful pains all over her, and she held her breath to prevent herself from crying out and waking her mother. She clutched the sheets in her agony, and at last, about 6 o'clock in the morning, she could bear it no longer, and in the anguish of labour screamed out and woke her mother. Mrs. Kemp was frightened out of her wits. Going upstairs, she woke the woman who lived on the floor above her. Without hesitating, the good lady put on a skirt and came down. "She's had a miss," she said, after looking at Liza. "Is there anyone you could send to the hospital? Now, I dunno who I could get at this hour. Well, I'll get me old man to go." So she called her husband and sent him off. She was a stout, middle-aged woman, rough-visaged and strong-armed. Her name was Mrs. Hodges. "It's lucky you came to me," she said, when she had settled down. "I go out nursing, you know, so I know all about it." "Well, you surprise me," said Mrs. Kemp. "I didn't know as Liza was that way. She never told me nothing about it. She know who it is has done it." "Now you ask me something I don't know," replied Mrs. Kemp. "But now I come to think of it, it must be that there Tom. He's been keeping company with Liza. He's a single man, so they'll be able to get married. That's something." "It ain't Tom," feebly said Liza. "Not him? Who is it then?" Liza did not answer. "Eh?" repeated the mother. "Who is it?" Liza lay still without speaking. "Never mind, Mrs. Kemp," said Mrs. Hodges. "Don't worry her now. You'll be able to find out all about it when she gets better." For a while the two women sat still, waiting the doctor's coming, and Liza lay gazing vacantly at the wall, panting for breath. Sometimes Jim crossed her mind, and she opened her mouth to call for him, but in her despair she restrained herself. The doctor came. "Do you think she's bad, Doctor?" asked Mrs. Hodges. "I'm afraid she is rather," he answered. "I'll come in again this evening." "Oh, Doctor," said Mrs. Kemp as he was going, "could you give me something for my rheumatics? I'm a martyr to rheumatism, and these cold days hardly knows what to do with myself. And, Doctor, could you let me have some beef tea? My husband's dead, and of course I can't do no work with my daughter ill like this, and we're very short." The day passed, and in the evening Mrs. Hodges, who had been attending to her own domestic duties, came downstairs again. Mrs. Kemp was on the bed sleeping. "I was just having a little nap," to Mrs. Hodges on waking. "How is the girl?" asked the lady. "Oh," answered Mrs. Kemp, "my rheumatics has been that bad I really haven't known what to do with myself, and now Liza can't rub me I'm worse than ever. It's unfortunate that she should get ill just now, when I want so much attending to myself, but there, it's just my luck." Mrs. Hodges went over and looked at Liza. She was lying just as when she left in the morning, her cheeks flushed, her mouth open for breath, and tiny beads of sweat stood on her forehead. "How are you, ducky?" asked Mrs. Hodges, but Liza did not answer. "It's my belief she's unconscious," said Mrs. Kemp. "I've been asking her who it was as done it, but she don't seem to hear what I say. It's been a great shock to me, Mrs. Hodges." "I believe you," replied the lady, sympathetically. "When you come in and said what it was, you might have knocked me down with a feather. I knew no more than the dead what had happened." "I saw at once what it was," said Mrs. Hodges, nodding her head. "Yes, of course you knew. I expect you've had a great deal of practice one way and another." "You're right, Mrs. Kemp, you're right. I've been on the job now for nearly 20 years, and if I don't know something about it, I ought." "Do you find it pays well?" "Well, Mrs. Kemp, take it all in all, I ain't got no grounds for complaint. I'm in the habit of asking 5 shillings, and I will say this, I don't think it's too much for what I do." The news of Liza's illness had quickly spread, and more than once in the course of the day a neighbour had come to ask after her. There was a knock at the door now, and Mrs. Hodges opened it. Tom stood on the threshold, asking to come in. "Yes, you can come," said Mrs. Kemp. He advanced on tiptoe, so as to make no noise, and for a while stood silently looking at Liza. Mrs. Hodges was by his side. "Can I speak to her?" he whispered. "She can't hear you." He groaned. "Do you think she'll get all right?" he asked. Mrs. Hodges shrugged her shoulders. "I shouldn't like to give an opinion," she said, cautiously. Tom bent over Liza, and blushing, kissed her, then, without speaking further, went out of the room. "That's the young man as was courting her," said Mrs. Kemp, pointing over her shoulder with her thumb. Soon after, the doctor came. "What do you think of her, Doctor?" said Mrs. Hodges, bustling forwards authoritatively, in her position of midwife and sick nurse. "I'm afraid she's very bad." "Do you think she's going to die?" she asked, dropping her voice to a whisper. "I'm afraid so." As the doctor sat down by Liza's side, Mrs. Hodges turned round and significantly nodded to Mrs. Kemp, who put her handkerchief to her eyes. Then she went outside to the little group waiting at the door. "What does the doctor say?" they asked, among them Tom. "He says just what I've been saying all along. I knew she wouldn't live." And Tom burst out, "Oh, Liza." As she retired, a woman remarked, "Mrs. Hodges is very clever, I think." "Yes," remarked another. "She got me through my last confinement simply wonderful. If it comes to choosing between them, I'd back Mrs. Hodges against 40 doctors." "To tell you the truth, so would I. I've never known her wrong yet." Mrs. Hodges sat down beside Mrs. Kemp and proceeded to comfort her. "Why don't you take a little drop of brandy to calm your nerves, Mrs. Kemp?" she said. "You want it." "I was just feeling rather faint, and I couldn't help thinking as how 2 penn'orth of whiskey 'ud do me good." "Now, Mrs. Kemp," said Mrs. Hodges earnestly, putting her hand on the other's arm, "you take my tip. When you're queer there's nothing like brandy for pulling you together. Don't object to whiskey myself, but as a medicine you can't beat brandy." "Well, I won't set up myself knowing better than you, Mrs. Hodges. I'll do what you think right." Quite accidentally there was some in the room, and Mrs. Kemp poured it out for herself and her friend. "I'm not in the habit of taking anything when I'm out on business," she apologized, "but just to keep you company, I don't mind if I do. Your health, Mrs. Hodges." "Same to you, and thank you, Mrs. Kemp." Liza lay still, breathing very quietly, her eyes closed. The doctor kept his fingers on her pulse. "I've been very unfortunate of late," remarked Mrs. Hodges as she licked her lips. "This makes the second death I've had in the last 10 days. Woman, I mean, of course. I don't count babies." "You don't say so." "Of course the other one, well, she was only a prostitute, so it didn't so much matter. It ain't like another woman, is it?" "No, you're right. Still, one don't like 'em to die, even if they are that. One mustn't be too hard on 'em." "Strikes me you've got a very kind aunt, Mrs. Hodges," said Mrs. Kemp. "I have that, and I often says it'd be better for my peace of mind and my business if I hadn't. I have to go through a lot, I do, but I can say this for myself, I always gives satisfaction, and that's something as all ladies in my line can't say." They sipped their brandy for a while. "It's a great trial to me that this should have happened," said Mrs. Kemp, coming to the subject that had been disturbing her for some time. "Mine's always been a very respectable family, and such a thing as this has never happened before." "No, Mrs. Hodges, I was lawfully married in the church, and I've got my licence, and I've got my marriage lines to show I was, and that one of my daughters should have gone wrong in this way, well, I can't understand it. I give her a good education, and she had all the comforts of her home. She never wanted for nothing. I worked myself to the bone to keep her in luxury, and then that she could go and disgrace me like this." "I understand what you mean, Mrs. Kemp. I can tell you, my family was very respectable, and my husband, he earned 25 shillings a week, and was in the same place 17 years, and his employers sent a very beautiful wreath to put on his coffin, and they tell me they never had such a good workman and such an honest man before. And me, well, I can say this, I've done my duty by the girl, and she's never learnt anything but good from me. Of course, I ain't always been in what you call flourishing circumstances, but I've always set her a good example, as she could tell you so herself, if she wasn't speechless." Mrs. Kemp paused for a moment's reflection. "As they say in the Bible," she finished, "it's enough to make one's grey hairs go down into the ground in sorrow. I can show you my marriage certificate. Of course, one doesn't like to say much, but of course, she's very bad. But if she got well, I should have given her a talking to." There was another knock. "Do go and see who that is. I can't, on account of my rheumatics." Mrs. Hodges opened the door. It was Jim. He was very white, and the blackness of his hair and beard, contrasting with the deathly pallor of his face, made him look ghastly. Mrs. Hodges stepped back. "Who's he?" she said, turning to Mrs. Kemp. Jim pushed her aside and went up to the bed. "Doctor, is she very bad?" he asked. The doctor looked at him questioningly. Jim whispered, "It was me as done it. She ain't going to die, is she?" The doctor nodded. "Oh God, what shall I do? It was my fault. I wish I was dead." Jim took the girl's head in his hands, and the tears burst from his eyes. "She ain't dead yet, is she?" "She's just living," said the doctor. Jim bent down. "Liza, Liza, speak to me. Liza, say you forgive me. Oh, speak to me." His voice was full of agony. The doctor spoke. "She can't hear you." "Oh, she must hear me. Liza, Liza." He sank on his knees by the bedside. They all remained silent, Liza lying stiller than ever, her breast unmoved by the feeble respiration. Jim looking at her very mournfully, the doctor grave, with his fingers on the pulse. The two women looked at Jim. "Fancy it being him," said Mrs. Kemp. "Strike me lucky, ain't he a sight?" "You have got her insured, Mrs. Kemp," said the midwife. She could bear the silence no longer. "Trust me for that," replied the good lady. "I've had her insured ever since she was born. Why, the only other day I was saying to myself that all that money had been wasted. But you see it wasn't. You never know your luck, you see." "Quite right. I'm a rare one for insuring. It's a great thing. I've always insured all my children." "The way I look on it is this," said Mrs. Kemp. "Whatever you do when they're alive, and we all know as children is very trying sometimes, you should give them a good funeral when they dies. That's my motto, and I've always acted up to it." "Do you deal with Mr. Stearman?" asked Mrs. Hodges. "No, Mrs. Hodges. For undertaking give me Mr. Footley every time. In the black line he's first, and the rest nowhere." "Well, that's very strange now. That's just what I think. Mr. Footley does his work well, and he's very reasonable. I'm a very old customer of his, and he lets me have things cheap as anybody." "Does he indeed? Well, Mrs. Hodges, if I ain't asking too much of you, I should look upon it as very kind if you'd go and make the arrangements for Liza." "Why, certainly, Mrs. Kemp. I'm always willing to do a good turn to anybody if I can." "I want it done very respectable," said Mrs. Kemp. "I'm not going to stint for nothing for my daughter's funeral. I like plumes, you know, although they is a bit extra." "Never you fear, Mrs. Kemp. It should be done as well as if it was for my own husband, and I can't say more than that. Mr. Footley thinks a deal of me, he does. Why, only the other day, as I was going into his shop, he says, 'Good morning, Mrs. Hodges.' 'Good morning, Mr. Footley.' Says I, 'You've just come in the nick of time,' says he. 'This gentleman and myself,' pointing to another gentleman as was standing there, 'and myself,' say I gives you all the work I can.' 'I believe you,' says he. 'Well,' he says, 'now which do you think? Does oak look better than helm, or does helm look better than oak? Oak versus helm, that's the question.' 'Well, Mrs. Footley,' says I, 'for my own private opinion, when you've got a nice brass plate in the middle, and nice brass handles each end, there's nothing like oak.' 'Quite right,' says he. 'That's what I think, for the coffins give me the oak any day, and I hope,' says he, 'when the Lord sees fit to call me to himself, I shall be put in a oak coffin myself.' 'Amen,' says I. 'I like oak,' said Mrs. Kemp. 'My poor husband, he had a oak coffin. We did have a job with him, I can tell you. You know he had dropsy, and he swell up. Oh, he did swell. His own mother wouldn't have known him. Why, his legs swell up, till it was as big round as his body. Swat me bob, it did." "Did it indeed?" ejaculated Mrs. Hodges. "Yes, and when he died they sent the coffin up. I didn't have Mr. Footley at that time. We didn't live here then. We lived in Battersea, and all our undertaking was done by Mr. Browning. Well, he sent the coffin up. We got my old man in, but we couldn't get the lid down. He was so swelled. Well, Mr. Browning, he was a great big man, 13 stone if he was an ounce. Well, he stood on the coffin, and a young man he had with him stood on it too, and the lid simply wouldn't go down. So Mr. Browning, he said, 'Jump on, missus.' So I was in my widow's weeds, you know, but we had to get it down, so I stood on it, and we all jumped, and at last we got it too, and screwed it. But law, we did have a job. I shall never forget it." Then all was silence, and a heaviness seemed to fill the air like a grey blight, cold and suffocating, and the heaviness was death. They felt the presence in the room, and they dared not move. They dared not draw their breath. The silence was terrifying. Suddenly a sound was heard, a loud rattle. It was from the bed, and rang through the morning, piercing the stillness. The doctor opened one of Liza's eyes and touched it. Then he lay on her breast, the hand he had been holding, and withdrew the sheet over her head. Jim turned away with a look of intense weariness on his face, and the two women began weeping silently. The darkness was sinking before the dawn, and a dim grey light came through the window. The lamp spluttered out. End of chapter 12. Recording by Haddon43, blogdelaquinzaine.wordpress.com. End of Liza of Lambeth by W. Somerset Maugham.